In the fall of 1985, a small team of 30 Nintendo employees drove a rented van around the suburbs of New Jersey, hauling 7-foot-tall cardboard display stands into toy stores that didn't want them, because the stores didn't want anything to do with video games. 2 years earlier, the American home gaming market had collapsed so completely that retailers were dumping game cartridges into bargain bins at $1 a piece just to clear warehouse space. The category was dead. The buyers had moved on. The analysts had written the obituary. The Nintendo employees kept driving. They set up the displays anyway. They demonstrated the games to anyone who would watch. They offered to take back every single unit that didn't sell at full price, no questions asked. By Christmas 1985, they had sold somewhere between 50,000 and 90,000 consoles in New York City alone. The exact number is disputed. Nintendo's own internal goal was 50,000, and they hit it. A New York Times story cited 90,000, which some insiders believed was Nintendo inflating the figures for press. Either way, it was enough. The American video game industry was not dead. It had just been waiting for someone with enough conviction to walk through the door and prove it. Another empire, another case. Here's what really happened. By 1984, the American home gaming market had lost 97% of its value in 2 years. $3.2 billion in 1982, $100 million by 1985. Retailers who had stocked Atari products watched millions of dollars in inventory become worthless almost overnight. The buyers at Sears, JCPenney, Macy's, and Toys R Us had made the same decision independently and arrived at the same conclusion: never again. The term video game had become toxic. Distributors had purged the category entirely from their inventory structures. If you walked into a major American retailer in 1984 and asked where the video games were, they would tell you they didn't carry them. This was the market Yamauchi decided to enter. His son-in-law, Arakawa, was running Nintendo of America out of a small office in Redmond, Washington. In 1983, before the crash had fully landed, Yamauchi had nearly solved the American distribution problem without having to solve it himself. He entered advanced negotiations with Atari to distribute the Famicom in the United States as the Atari 26,000. Atari would handle the retail chips. Nintendo would supply the hardware. It was a clean solution. It fell apart at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in June 1983, when Atari executives discovered Coleco demonstrating its Atom computer running Donkey Kong, a title Atari believed they held the home console rights to. It was a legal misunderstanding that spiraled into a corporate dispute. The negotiations stalled. Atari's CEO, Ray Kassar, was fired shortly after. The deal died with his job. Nintendo was on its own. In January 1985, Arakawa brought a redesigned Famicom to the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, a sleek computer-like device called the Advanced Video System. It had a keyboard, it had a tape drive, it had a wireless infrared controllers. It was positioned not as a game console, but as a home computer, designed specifically to sidestep the retail ban on video games by looking like something else entirely. The retail buyers rejected it anyway. The home computer market was locked in a brutal price war driven by Commodore. Nobody wanted another machine competing in that space. The Advanced Video System generated $0. Arakawa flew back to Redmond with nothing. What happened next was not a product decision. It was a psychological operation. Nintendo wasn't going to convince American retailers that video games were worth selling again. They were going to make American retailers believe they weren't buying video games at all. The strategy that emerged from the AVS failure was built on a single insight. The retail buyers who were refusing to stock video games were toy buyers, not electronics buyers, toy buyers. And toy buyers thought in completely different categories. Arakawa, Howard Lincoln, and marketing executive Peter Main rebuilt the entire product identity from the ground up. They stripped out the keyboard and computer peripherals. They redesigned the console casing to look like a front-loading VCR, a trusted household appliance that lived next to the television and nobody was afraid of. They stopped calling it a console. They called it the control deck. They stopped calling the games cartridges. They called them game packs. The product entirely, not the Famicom, not the advanced video system, but the Nintendo Entertainment System. And they built a robot. Rob, the robotic operating buddy, was a battery-powered toy robot designed by Gunpei Yokoi that responded to optical flashes from a television screen to manipulate physical spinning tops on a small platform. It was slow. It only worked with 2 games, Gyromite and Stack Up. It required precise alignment with the television to function, and even then the optical reception was temperamental enough that Nintendo's own sales staff found it genuinely challenging to demonstrate convincingly. None of that mattered, though. Rob wasn't a product. Rob was a key. When Nintendo's sales representatives walked into a retailer in the summer of 1985, they weren't pitching a video game console. They were pitching an interactive robotic toy that happened to connect to a television. The conversation happened in the toy department with toy buyers about a toy budget line. Rob was featured on the front of every package, every advertisement, and every 7-foot retail display stand. The console itself was secondary. And it worked. Nintendo launched the NES in New York City on October 18th, 1985. New York was Yamauchi's call over the objections of his own American team, who had quietly hoped to test in a smaller, more forgiving market like Houston or Nashville. Yamauchi wanted the toughest market in the country, the highest concentration of press, the biggest retailers, the city that Atari's collapse had hit hardest. The Hackensack warehouse became Nintendo of America's operational base for the launch, a vermin-infested storage facility in New Jersey where 30 employees built display stands, loaded vans, and drove them to stores across the tri-state area 7 days a week. To get retailers to take the inventory at all, Arakawa offered something the American gaming industry had never offered before: 100% buyback. Nintendo would ship the product, build the displays, and manage the stock at zero upfront cost to the retailer. If anything remained unsold after 90 days, Nintendo would buy it back at full price and remove it from the store. The retailers risked nothing but floor space. By Christmas 1985, Nintendo had moved somewhere between 50,000 and 90,000 units out of New York City alone. The robot nobody could quite figure out had gotten a video game console onto American toy store shelves 2 years after the entire industry had been declared dead. The harder question was whether they could do it everywhere else. New York tests proved the concept. Scaling it nationally was a different problem entirely. Nintendo of America had 30 employees and a warehouse in New Jersey. The United States had thousands of retail locations across 50 states that all needed to be pitched, stocked, displayed, and managed individually. Nintendo didn't have the infrastructure for a national rollout, and building it from scratch would take years they didn't have. The solution came from an unlikely source: a toy company run by former Atari executives. Worlds of Wonder had been founded by Don Kingsborough and launched 2 products that were defining the 1986 toy landscape. Teddy Ruxpin was the best-selling toy in America. Laser tag was coming. Every major retailer in the country needed Worlds of Wonder's allocation for the holiday season, and they knew it. Nintendo struck a distribution deal with Worlds of Wonder that turned that leverage into something remarkable. When Worlds of Wonder sales representatives walked into a Toys R Us or a department store to negotiate the Teddy Ruxpin and laser tag holiday orders, they bundled the conversation with a requirement. If the retailer wanted the hot toys, they also had to commit to a quota of Nintendo Entertainment Systems, often 500 units per order. Retailers who had sworn off video games 2 years earlier were suddenly stocking NES hardware because it was the price of admission for the products that they actually wanted. Nintendo expanded from New York to Los Angeles in February 1986, then to Chicago, San Francisco, and 12 additional major markets through spring and summer. The official nationwide rollout launched September 27, 1986, with a new bundle, the Control Deck Package, at $89.99, stripped of ROB and the Zapper, and packaged directly with Super Mario Bros. By the close of the 1986 fiscal year, Nintendo had sold between 1.1 and 1.4 million hardware units in the United States. And then, the Worlds of Wonder relationship ended the way a lot of relationships in the gaming industry ended. Badly. The popular version of the story is that Nintendo simply outgrew the partnership. The less comfortable version, supported by legal and industry records, is that Nintendo terminated Worlds of Wonder's distribution rights following internal accusations of financial mismanagement. When Worlds of Wonder filed for bankruptcy in 1987, Nintendo moved quickly to hire the company's displaced sales representatives directly, absorbing the elite retail sales force that former Atari veterans had built into Nintendo of America's own operation. The people who had once sold Atari products, then Teddy Ruxpin, were now selling Nintendo. Nintendo had the hardware on shelves and the distribution network in place. What they still needed was a guarantee that history wouldn't repeat itself, that the shelves wouldn't fill up with unplayable software the way they had under Atari. The system they built to prevent that from happening would reshape the entire relationship between platform holders and game developers for the next 4 decades. The 10 NES lockout chip was built into every American NES console. A matching chip had to be present inside the game cartridge for the system to boot. Without it, the console entered an endless reset loop. No chip, no game. This wasn't primarily designed to restrict third-party developers. Internal engineering documents suggest it was originally built as a piracy countermeasure against counterfeit cartridge factories in Taiwan and unauthorized rental duplication. The third-party restrictions came through contracts rather than silicon. Those contracts were ironclad. Third-party publishers were limited to 5 games per year on the platform. All cartridges had to be physically manufactured by Nintendo in Japan, paid for entirely upfront by the publisher, with supply kept intentionally tight to prevent price slashing. Licensees were prohibited from porting NES titles to competing platforms for 2 years after release. The result was the Nintendo Seal of Quality, a gold badge on every licensed game that told the consumer that this product had passed Nintendo's internal standards. After years of buying Atari cartridges that turned out to be barely functional ports of arcade games, American consumers responded to that promise. Super Mario Bros. Was the product that completed the argument. Designed by Shigeru Miyamoto and bundled with the Control Deck from early 1986 onward, it sold over 40 million copies worldwide and became the best-selling video game of all time for more than 2 decades. It transformed Mario into a global pop culture icon. Surveys by the late 1980s found American children recognize Mario more readily than Mickey Mouse. The market recovery was staggering. From $100 million in 1985, the American home gaming industry climbed back to $2.3 billion by 1988 and exceeded $4 billion by 1990, surpassing even the pre-cash peak. Nintendo captured an estimated 80 to 90% of that recovered market. An industry that had been declared dead in 1983 was not only alive by 1990, it was larger than it had ever been. Minoru Arakawa quietly continued running Nintendo of America through the 1990s, never seeking the spotlight, content to let the product speak. He retired in 2002 after helping guide the company through the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy, and the Nintendo 64 eras. He remains one of the most consequential figures in the history of American gaming, and one of the least discussed. Howard Lincoln became chairman of Nintendo of America before leaving to run the Seattle Mariners baseball team, which Nintendo purchased a controlling stake in to prevent the franchise from relocating in 1992. Peter Main, the marketing architect who coined the language of control decks and game packs, retired from Nintendo in 1999 after presiding over some of the most effective consumer marketing campaigns the toy industry had ever seen. and the former Atari veterans who built Worlds of Wonders sales network, the same people who had once tried to move Atari 2600 consoles off shelves, ended their careers selling Nintendo products for the company that had replaced everything Atari used to be. The pattern holds. Companies fall. The people who built them carry the knowledge somewhere else. And sometimes that knowledge ends up building the thing that made the original irrelevant. You now know how 30 people in a New Jersey warehouse, a robot nobody could quite operate, and a distribution deal built on Teddy Ruxpin leverages, resurrected a dead industry and handed one company 80 to 90% of the American gaming market. What you don't know yet is what happened when someone decided to fight back. When a Japanese arcade company looked at Nintendo's dominance and decided the